When analyzing a film or TV series, one may sometimes miss important aspects which may not register at first on the conscious level. One may discover new meanings upon the continued viewing of a movie or episode of a series, even after one thought they had turned every stone. Such is the case with fine works of art. My previous series on Patrick McGoohan's The Prisoner, called Tyranny of the Masses, is an overview of the themes of the series. But even with that 6-part analysis, I could only briefly touch upon the complexities of many of the episodes. However, this series, The Prisoner Revisited, will attempt to tackle individually some of the episodes that couldn't be given their proper due. And in this video, I will focus on the penultimate episode, Once Upon a Time. Originally named Degree Absolute, Once Upon a Time was intended to be the finale of a 6-episode season, but it was moved to second to last place when negotiations with ITC determined that the series would be one season of 17 episodes, with the ending rewritten to set the stage for the final episode. Once Upon a Time was one of 3 stories that were written by Patrick McGoohan himself, the other 2 being the series finale, Fallout, and an earlier episode in the series called Free For All, credited as having been penned by one Patty Fitz, a nom de plume of McGoohan. This episode was initially going to have another of McGoohan's pen names, Archibald Schwartz, credited as its screenwriter. McGoohan described Once Upon a Time as his autobiographical work. In the episode, we see Patrick McGoohan and co-star Leo McKern giving their most intense performances. During filming, the 2 men, according to the show's crew members, transformed into their contending characters. McGoohan was as forceful and antagonistic when the cameras were off as he was when they were rolling, and the stress of this drove McKern to suffer a nervous breakdown. It is by far among the most theatrical, complex, well-written, de jour episodes of the series, and remains one of the most popular among fans of the show. But what is it that makes this episode so powerful? In this video, I will show that what Once Upon a Time depicts is the phases of childhood development, the existential crises of life in the modern world, psychological mirroring, and most importantly, and what sets it apart from any other episode of any other television show, its astonishing depiction of the mystical concept known as the Dark Night of the Soul. There are a large number of themes running through the last 2 episodes. McGoohan had a lot to say, and he said it all. The story begins with the return of a number 2 from a previous episode who failed to crack number 6. He is aggravated about something, and he takes it out on the butler. We can assume that he's just come from having an argument with his superior over how to deal with number 6, since his first words to his superior on the phone is, "And you can remove that thing too," referring to Rover, the village's security, who has been placed in this seat as if put there to taunt him.
Remove it! I told you to remove it! And you can remove that thing too. I'm not an inmate. You can say what you like. You brought me back here. I told you the last time you were using the wrong approach. I do it my way, or you find somebody else. Leave the coffee. The coffee, leave it! How many times do I have to ask?
I'll come back to this particular scene in due course, as it has relevance to later developments in the episode. Number 2 studies number 6's file, which contains his entire personal history and chronicles his time in the village. Number 2 convinces his unseen superior to allow him to carry out an operation known as Degree Absolute, in which number 6 will be regressed to the mental state of a child, then taken by number 2 to a special room underneath the village. There, he will relive parts of his life as number 2 endeavors to psychologically break him. He is given the time frame of a week to accomplish this, accompanied only by the butler, who will serve as his assistant. Number 2 states that the process could mean the death of either one of them.
Degree absolute. I require approval.
Unlike me, many of you have accepted the situation of your imprisonment and will die here like rotten cabbages.
If you think he's that important, there's certainly no other alternative. You must risk either one of us.
Who's standing beside you now? I intend to discover who are the prisoners and who the warders.
I am a good man. I was a good man, but if you get him, he will be better, and there's no other way. I repeat, no other way.
I will not make any deals with you. I've resigned.
Degree absolute. Tonight, please.
I will not be pushed, filed, stamped, indexed, briefed, debriefed, or numbered.
Look, that's not long enough. You don't want to damage him?
My life is my own.
Very well. Tonight.
To initiate this regression, Number 2 takes helm of the control room to target Number 6 as he sleeps in his quarters. Number 2 tells the control room supervisor to check the profundity as the supervisor begins counting up to 6. The supervisor is otherwise standing in one spot as they watch Number 6 toss and turn in his bed on screen. After the first wave band, Number 2 tells him to repeat and increase. The supervisor does so with a more intense edge to his voice. Then a third time, but Number 2 tells him to go slower and hold on 5. As the supervisor slowly counts up to 5 and repeats 5 over and over, his voice becomes more and more strained and his face becomes tense and sweaty, while Number 6 struggles violently. Number 2 tells him to diminish, and the supervisor begins to lower the intensity of his repeated 5s until instructed to stop. What's interesting about this is that apart from the 2 men on the observational apparatus in the center of the room, Number 2 and the supervisor are the only people present in the control room, the rest of the personnel having been sent out.
Third wave band. Slow. And hold on 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5, 5, 5, 5, 5, diminish! 5, 5, 5, 5, 5, 5. Safe enough.
It could be that the supervisor has some sort of psychic abilities allowing him to target an individual and put him in a hypnotically receptive state. That's speculation on my part, but it could be a possibility. The word profundity means a state of being profound, or of being in a deep place or an abyss. The repeated number 5 has significance as well. In Pythagoreanism, 5 is the pentad. There are only 4 directions, but the pentad moves in a 5th direction. The pentad opens the way to a new world, a new dimension. To the Pythagoreans, the pentad is life, for it brings the principle of life into the vegetative soul. It is also breakdown, in that it is a disruption from stasis. It's worthy of note that throughout the episode, Number 6, unable to even say the number 6, let alone acknowledge himself as such, will readily say 5 instead. In this sense, it has a deeper significance, but more on that later. After the control room scene, Number 6 has been regressed to a state of unconscious existence within the womb. This begins a process of development which we will see play out rapidly as the episode progresses, from birth to adulthood. Shakespeare's 7 Ages of Man, as Number 2 quotes later. This process begins with Number 6 in a state of sleep. In a dynamic sense, non-existence is simply the potential to exist. The unconscious mind, which in its purest state is universal, thus represents the potential ground from which all life may emerge. Thus everyone who is conceived has eternally existed in the dark of the pure unconscious mind. Conscious life can be seen then, not as an entirely new beginning, but rather as the awakening from a sleep of infinite duration. The goal of life is to return to this original state, but transformed into the light of pure consciousness. In Jungian terms, this is called individuation. The self and the world are initially experienced totally as one. Now, superficially, this seems to be identical to the most developed state of mystical union. This first stage is a pre-personal, fully undifferentiated state, whereas mystical union is the final transpersonal, fully differentiated state. So in this sense, they are at opposite extremes and totally different. If we adopt a conscious linear approach to the stages of development, earlier prepersonal stages are at the furthest removed in development from later transpersonal stages. However, if we adopt the equally valid unconscious circular approach to the same stages, then there is a direct complementarity as between earlier stages and later stages. In other words, the potential, which was inherent in an undifferentiated manner at the earlier stage, is finally realized in a differentiated manner in the later complementary stage. Number 6's ordeal begins in the womb state, and it ends in a place called the embryo, where he is reborn in another way.
Humpty Dumpty sat on the wall. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. All the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty together again. Jack and Jill went up the hill to fetch a pail of water. Jack fell down and broke his crown, and Jill came tumbling after. Oh, the grand old Duke of York, he had 1,000 men. He marched them up to the top of the hill, and he marched them down again. Humpty Dumpty sat on the wall. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. All the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty together again.
Notice the pattern of the nursery rhymes which number 2 is singing. Fell down, marched them down, had a great fall. At the beginning of finite existence, the unconscious is completely undifferentiated. There is only the unconscious. The functions of thinking, feeling, intuition, and sensation are in an unseparated state. At the dawn of life, one emerges into consciousness, discovering through this process both the world and the self in a physical manner, emerging as a separate individual existing in time, an identifiable unit of life. However, from the complementary unconscious standpoint, linear time has no meaning. Number 6, being born, has fallen from this state of unconsciousness in the womb into time and space. The lamp which administers this reversion pulses and hums, the cord to the ceiling even resembling an umbilical cord. We see another device which repeats this process when number 6 is regressed by number 2 again later on in the episode. And this contraption looks even more like a womb, surrounding number 6's head in glass. He is not being regressed to the state of an infant in both of these cases. He is being brought back into the womb to be born again. He is reliving the emergence of his consciousness, and thus, literally, becoming a number, or an independent self. The straight line serves as an ideal geometrical symbol of the conscious mind. It is also the same symbol we use to represent unity in mathematics, in essence the number 1. The very basis of consciousness is the ability to recognize an object as a separate unit and thus to give it an identifiable existence, something apart from nothing. The major religions of the West, where conscious linear perspective dominates, sees their God objectively as the One, apart from all creation, in the superlunar realm above the firmament. And their ultimate experience involves forming a union with that One. It is not surprising, therefore, that the unseen God of the village is known as number 1. The circle, conversely, is the ideal geometrical symbol for the unconscious mind. This is the symbol we use to represent 0 in mathematics. This circular lamp also pulsates as he sleeps. Consciousness can be seen as the clear separations of unconnected polar opposites, carrying either a positive or a negative charge. It operates on a definite either-or logic. Something either is or is not in static terms, which implies an absolute view of phenomenal reality. But the unconscious, on the other hand, can be seen as the dynamic interdependence of what are complementary opposites, carrying both a positive and a negative charge. It operates on a both-and logic. Something both is and is not in dynamic terms, which implies a relative view of reality. The room where number 6 is brought to later on by number 2 to relive his past is called the embryo, and it is also circular. In it, time and space are transcended, and number 6 faces his unconscious content. The belief that consciousness has a definite finite beginning and end in temporal terms is itself purely a product of the conscious perspective. Here there is a clear distinction between existence and non-existence. However, from the complementary unconscious perspective, existence and non-existence are simply two sides of the same coin. A crucial detail often overlooked in this scene is the tone in which number 2 sings the nursery rhymes. He sings them forcefully and very loud, which would normally wake a child up. In fact, after this scene, there is a sharp cut to the next morning, so we really don't know how long through the night he was singing to number 6 in this way before he fell asleep. But he is doing this specifically to influence number 6 in the womb. The first primitive stage of life crucially relates to the development as a fetus in the womb. Though still mainly unconscious, and in a highly confused state, the newborn's prior existence before birth is extremely important, as it encoded a master program in the psyche governing all future emotional development. The developing fetus has no means to distinguish the impersonal physical world from the personal world of the self. The self and the world are still largely undifferentiated. Because this identification of the self with the maternal womb is also experienced as the material cosmos, the self is very much a material self. Thus this stage is sometimes referred to as the material or plurimatic self, with a protoplasmic or symbiotic consciousness. The fetus is entirely dependent on the mother for its physical and emotional survival in this symbiotic state. The mother's life is largely, physically and emotionally, the child's life. Basic emotional messages are communicated directly to the child in the womb. These constitute that critical master program which deeply conditions subsequent emotional development. For example, many people, regardless of their achievements, find it almost impossible to accept themselves throughout life. When this is a severe problem, it likely goes back directly to that first relationship within the womb. Because of the lack yet of any defense mechanisms, the fetus is completely vulnerable and will pick up accurately the basic unconscious emotional attitude of the mother. If this is one of love and trust, the fetus will unconsciously adopt that same attitude as its master program, so to speak. However, if the basic unconscious attitude of the mother was one of deep fear and hostility, the fetus will unconsciously adopt that negative attitude as its master program. This subsequently will lead the developing child to view the world and relationships from the same attitude. Tackling this cannot be done merely on the conscious level, as the problem lies deep in the unconscious mind. Integration will require a very difficult and painful task of journeying back psychologically to the womb to fully disentangle this problematic unconscious template. In the narrative, number 6's journeying back is done in the room known as the embryo. The next morning, number 2 removes the lamp and awakens number 6 with an offer to go for a walk and to show him some nice things. Number 6 promptly rises out of bed and smiles innocently, but he does not speak. They then descend underground into the embryo room. Number 6 is brought there in a wheelchair, a stand-in for a baby stroller, and he eats an ice cream cone as they are delivered to the entrance. This stage depicted in these scenes generally starts shortly after birth. The infant has now been separated from the mother's womb and exists physically as a distinct body. The psychological recognition of this fact comes only gradually. The self at this stage is sometimes termed the Ouroboros self, after the mythical serpent that after eating its own tail forms a self-contained, pre-differentiated round mass. Again, circular symbolism, and this stage is still very close to the undifferentiated unconsciousness. However, this stage has advanced from the earlier plermatic self. The complete union with the mother, which has now been broken physically, has also been broken psychologically. Life begins from a single point or singularity, where there is the first emergence from the unconscious into primitive consciousness. Here, the total fusion of undifferentiated opposites in the unconscious at last ends at the point where division into separate opposites of consciousness commences. There are really two basic instincts relating to the conflicting desires for incorporation and for autonomy. The basic instinct at the earlier stage relates to the former desire. But now, with the infant physically separated from the mother, the latter instinct, autonomy, begins to surface with a blind desire for physical survival. The infant is caught in a conflicting situation, which signals a first crisis. If growth is to take place, complete dependence on the mother has to be surrendered with the gradual acceptance of a separate physical body. At this early stage of development, the consciousness is only slightly differentiated. The ability to separate from the unconsciousness is still very weak. Consequently, the faculty to counterbalance stimuli is also very weak. Very little object or self-constancy is yet possible, as only fleeting impressions of both arise and disappear in a momentary present. The infant is vaguely aware of a world apart from himself, sometimes experienced as benign, sometimes as hostile. Much is made here of the oral stage and the instinct for food. The infant, in an attempt to remove the threat of the other, desires in the most primitive sense to assimilate the world through the mouth. The consequent fear is of being swallowed by the other, as if by a great beast. We will see later, at a time when one is trying to shift from a selfish, egocentric state to a higher one, that fears of being swallowed up and suffocated arise again in a dramatic fashion. Through separation and consequent stirrings of primordial existential fear, the infant slowly becomes aware of a globalized and as yet undifferentiated physical reality, confronting a self which has no clear boundaries yet. Early activity, known as sensory motor activity, is taken up as a direct exploration of the newfound physical environment.
At first, the infant mewling and puking in the nurse's arms. Be still! Even as a child, there is something in your brain that is a puzzlement. I intend to discover it.
As number 2 writes on the chalkboard, number 6 grabs a rattle and begins playing with it. He also begins looking around, observing a spotlight. He has now reached the sensory motor period. Here, the child, in a highly tactical manner, explores the immediate physical environment, gradually distinguishing its details. In the process, the child identifies with a more clearly defined separate self as an ego body. This stage can be called the typhonic state. The typhon was a mythical creature that was half human and half serpent. The stage is a halfway point between the undifferentiated unconsciousness and the differentiated consciousness. It is a pre-logical time where confusion between both unconscious and conscious processes still predominates.
I'm your father. Do I ever say anything that makes you want to hate me?
Number 2's first role is as number 6's father, and he asks him to remember any negative memories of him. The infant is very much rooted in the immediate present. The ability to recall past events or anticipate future ones is still rudimentary. Complex image structuring is not yet operational. Objects have a somewhat transient significance. They only exist for the child when present in experience. The power to consciously grasp that an object still exists when outside direct observation has not yet developed. This is due to the lack of differentiation in consciousness. Number 6's aversion to the word father is very important, because already we have a negative association. I will speak more about that later in relation to the development of the superego. The child's interpretation, when it is in reduced conscious terms, leads to a fundamental distortion of experience, where the unconscious role becomes greatly limited. This leads to a rigidity in concept formation. In this early stage, the child has a healthy interaction between unconscious and conscious processes. The first images the infant creates are of the parents, first the mother, then the father, as well as other key environmental factors. Experience then switches to the formation of body images, in essence, an image of one's own physical body as being separate from the overall environment. So the experience of space and time is modified, though still very much in an extended present, which could not be called linear. Conscious experience always involves the psychological operation of positing. The dynamic switching in experience from subject to object and from object to subject involves the counterbalancing unconscious phenomenon of negation, operating through the unconscious. Although in relation to each other, external and internal are opposite poles. However, both are experienced consciously. This invariably creates friction, making necessary a continual switching from one pole to the other, which is the key dynamic of experience. When the child starts to realize that experience is not just of the external world or the internal self, but rather involves a relationship between both poles, the first conscious graspings of negative existence develop. That is, he begins to realize that there are objects apart from himself. The scene with the seesaw, which number 2 and number 6 play on, perfectly illustrates this interaction. A switch begins to take place from an external to internal consciousness, influenced by the unconsciousness. When this takes place, there is a harmony between those two poles. When the child perceives an object apart from him, he is aware of it as external. However, due to this fusion, he is able to posit the more general concept of the object. There's a general interaction between a specific particular perception and the general concept. One cannot be experienced without the other. In this, the unconscious plays a crucial process. On the seesaw, number 2 begins to sing Seesaw Marjorie Doll. He repeats the word Jackie as number 6 repeats the word master. When this happens, we see number 2 going up and number 6 going down. Number 2 says the word father, and number 6 stops, then jumps off the seesaw, causing number 2 to fall to the ground. So we see a negative association and an imbalance already present within number 6's psyche.
Marjorie Doll, Jackie We shall have a new master. So, Marjorie Dog.
Jackie
Shall have
a new master.
a new master.
Master.
Jackie.
Master.
Jackie.
Master.
Jackie.
Master.
Mother.
Master.
Father.
Brother.
Friends.
Brother. Brother.
Friends.
Friends.
In our culture, the masters have ensured that higher development means the screening out of the unconscious process in favor of a reduced, distorted, conscious interpretation of experience. One of the key features of the earlier stages is an inability to distinguish general from partial reality. Without this, there's little capacity to form images to promote stability and gradually give extension to experience. In this stage, there's an emergence of a new ability to differentiate in experience parts which are in some degree separate from the overall environment. One more thing about this scene. It is the first after degree absolute begins in which we hear number 6 speak. A significant development of this stage is the use of language. Language can be seen as a system of symbols for social communication, geared to the extended experience of space and time. The growing experience of the infant brings the gradual realization of other selves, as illustrated in the playground scene. Language forms the ideal means of establishing agreed social symbols, enabling communication to be standardized. This, in our culture, increases the specialization of consciousness in an increasingly linear fashion, as we see in the following scene.
School.
School.
School. Creeping like snail. Unwillingly. To school. 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 School.
Report to my study in the morning break.
Number 2 suggests to number 6 that he is now in school. Number 6 is now in the concrete stages of development, the beginnings of ego development, where reality is understood increasingly in terms of reduced conscious categories. In the child's cognitive development, there is now representational thinking. Images provided through the affective sensory function are now used as the basis of thought, which steadily becomes more rational. Now, at least in terms of reality, and with the help of the structured use of language, the child is better able to make logical connections in experience. Links between different and separate objects are made in a step-by-step fashion. This serves to give linear extension to the experience of space and time. The child becomes able to break whole objects into parts, which have a separate identity, and yet are components of the original whole. Understanding is now sufficiently developed at this stage as to enable concepts to develop in consciousness. However, this is a highly reductionist activity, for now the concepts, just like the perceptions which preceded, are simply posited in consciousness, without any explicit recognition of the role of the unconscious. The problem with the linear level of specialization of newly formed conscious structures is that understanding, which involves a dynamic interaction of both conscious and unconscious, becomes increasingly reduced to a static and thus distorted, merely conscious interpretation. Although the unconscious still fuels the dynamics of understanding, since it is not recognized, understanding gradually ceases developing, severely limiting the true discovery of the mind's potential. Development now becomes more and more dominated by the cognitive mode. Before, the child identified with a physical world and a body ego. Now the process of creating a mental world through conceptual thinking and a mental self capable of controlling desires and impulses through reason emerges. The child now transcends the earlier stage of mere physical reality and moves into a more complex mental reality. But this differentiation of new structures tends to coincide with the significant repression of earlier structures. Conscious phenomena serves essentially as necessary signposts on the road to meaning. Reductionism, however, in the exclusive identification of meaning with conscious processes of understanding, always leads to a distortion of perspective, and consequently to a great limiting in the potential of true personality development. The child increasingly understands space and time in a linear fashion. The experience of space depends on the affective mode operating through the senses, whereas experience of time depends on the cognitive mode operating through reason. At this stage, which is still highly dependent upon the senses, the child is more conscious of space being extended in a linear fashion, through activities increasingly becoming more stable and interconnected.
Come in. Take off your hat in my presence.
Sorry, sir.
You were talking in class.
No, sir.
You refused to admit it.
I wasn't, sir.
You know who was?
Yes, sir.
Who was it? This is the 9th day since the incident. You have been in my study every morning at this time, and you still refuse to cooperate. Today is your last chance. Wasn't you?
Yes, sir.
You know who it was?
Yes, sir.
Who was it? That is cowardice.
That's honor, sir.
We don't talk about such things.
You should teach it, sir.
You're a fool.
Yes, sir. Not a rat.
A rat.
Rat.
I'm a rat.
No, sir. I'm a fool. Not a rat.
Number 6 is told to remove his hat when he enters the schoolmaster's room, the hat he wore in a previous scene, in essence, in his previous stage on the schoolyard. We now learn of rules that have been broken. We hear of concepts of honor and disgrace. The stasis in the linear cognitive mode is illustrated in number 2's schoolmaster attire. He is dressed in a black mortarboard cap and gown, and he wears a peculiar pair of wooden glasses with horizontal slits. His vision is strictly horizontal and linear, and he intends to make number 6's vision that way as well. With number 6's banter about his number of lashes, we now see concrete operational thinking, which usually develops at or around age 7. Number 6 has an aversion to the number 6, and bargains for 12 lashes instead, so that he can remember, in his words.
You will take 6. 6 of the best.
I'm not guilty, sir.
10.
12. What? 12, sir. So that I can remember.
This one-upping is typical of schoolboy bravado, but something else is being shown here as well. At this stage, the child develops the ability to control concrete activities through the use of reason. This is a switch from the previous stage of perceptions to concepts, which are now more developed and used directly to establish a logical relationship between perceptions. Implicitly, this necessitates the need for a greater fusion of opposites in the unconsciousness, stemming from the dynamic relationship that the child has in his dealings with the world. But even though this unconscious activity is required for the formulation of concepts, it is not recognized at this stage in development. At the level of conscious cognitive understanding, objects are always composite, with a significance that is entirely relative to its circumstance. Illustrating this stage is the odd assortment of props and settings surrounding number 6. The objects are abstract, removed from one another. However, in number 6's psyche, they are forming a coherent picture. This is what takes place in the concrete stages of child development. The perception of an object comes through a conscious positing process. The counterbalancing negative activity of the unconscious fuses with the former, creating a transformation of understanding. In other words, from the particular perception of a door or a chair comes the general concept or class of door or chair. Conscious understanding involves the dynamic interaction between the physical object itself and the mental object. All of these objects in isolation are separate and distinguishable from one another, but on another level, they are in relationship to each other as common objects. At the most basic level, they fit into the all-encompassing general class of object. On a more specific level, they can be the component parts of a classroom, a playground, a restaurant, a courtroom, and so on. In this way, every object has, in dynamic terms, a dual complementary aspect: its existence, or being clearly defined as a whole independent unit, and its general common existence, or its relationship to other objects as a component part. This understanding process is a dynamic that involves both the conscious and the unconscious, the former giving a separate identity to the objects and the latter a common shared identity, the part versus the whole. However, when the unconscious contribution is not explicitly recognized, objects are reduced to static single parts. This leads to a fragmentation of experience and a loss of any personal significance. In the school scenes, we see this fragmentation already beginning. This is already well underway in childhood, as the undifferentiated fantasies of the earlier stages are left behind in favor of a more defined, but also more restrictive process of understanding and acculturation. The growing conceptual understanding of the child is hindered and reduced to a linear experience of space and time.
Society.
Yes, sir.
Society is a place where people exist together.
Yes, sir.
That is civilization.
Yes, sir.
The lone wolf belongs to the wilderness.
Yes, sir.
You must not grow up to be a lone wolf.
No, sir.
You must conform.
Yes, sir.
It is my sworn duty to see that you do conform.
Yes, sir.
Number 2's demands for number 6's absolute conformity introduces us to the formal stage, or formal operational thinking stage. At this stage, the conceptual ability is able to generalize and deal with highly aggregated or composite objects. The child on the threshold of adolescence is able to form increasingly general relationships between objects in space. It is not yet a totally abstract stage, and still requires a degree of cooperation from the senses. One begins to mold views on wider issues: moral, social, political, religious, etc. He is no longer just dealing with logical specific objects, but rather the multiple connections between them, a higher level of interaction between the self and the world, continually positing and negating specific objects through his interactions with them, enabling him to move progressively onto a wider and more generalized appreciation of objects. Just as in the concrete stages, where experience moved from a physical response to the environment towards mental control over the environment, likewise the same direction of movement takes place here. After a period of positing general sense objects, the child develops the ability to transcend these objects with the exercise of formal conceptual control. The growing fusion of the positive external objects with the negative internal self enables one to withdraw from the pull of sense objects and thus develop mental concepts of a general nature. The child is now able to operate on his own thought processes, largely free from any sense interference. Here we see the beginnings of formal reasoning and philosophical reflection on the nature of truth. The child's experience of time changes during this stage from specific to general, from time as a linear extension through mental control of activities in one's immediate environment, to a more holistic view of time as universal, all events taking place in linear time. The rational paradigm, which dominates Western culture, is the product of this stage. The problem is that this is a highly reduced view of truth. Everything becomes interpreted in terms of what is merely one avenue of understanding, which itself can be distorted. While we see the cognitive mode develop in real time in the first minutes of degree absolute, we see a secondary mode emerge as well, the affective mode. Whereas cognitive understanding is the direct expression of the conscious process and the basis of what is general, impersonal, and universal, affective understanding is the direct expression of the unconscious process and what is immediate, personal, and unique. Essentially, the affective mode is the means by which the self responds to reality and is the direct basis of social identity, whereas the cognitive mode is the means by which the self exercises control over reality and is the direct basis for individual identity. Both modes, in a dynamic sense, are complementary and interact with experience. The affective mode is the emotional approach. It is a means by which polar opposites are united. Emotion always directly involves subject and object in a common experience. It is personal in nature, and the means by which we are able to emotionally respond to our environment. This mode has a uniqueness to it, which renders it more difficult to give a general evaluation. In the episode, this affective mode is first expressed in number 6's attitude towards his father. There is often a tendency, wherever the rational paradigm is paramount, to reduce the affective mode to the cognitive mode. The difficulty with affective development during the concrete and formal stages is that the conscious process can be made increasingly specialized and dominant over all experience. The education system is specifically designed to do so. This inevitably entails considerable repression of the affective responses and the unconscious, which leads to pathology, as is well known in the world of psychology. The evolutionary and historical cultural process, certainly in the West, has been geared to the specialized use of the conscious process, the prevailing rational paradigm, and the linear level. In spite of an abundance of psychologists, from Freud onwards, whose analysis of personality development breaks from the confines of a mere linear understanding of consciousness, Western man still stays within these confines. In spite of the major religions' claim to help one in transcending this level, in practice they often tend to encourage a conformist mentality, which stifles authentic development. The education system, which has its roots in the Prussian military model, is concerned with standardization over personal development.
Congratulations, my boy. You will do well. We are proud of you. Proud that you have learnt to manage your rebellious spirit. Proud that your obedience is absolute.
We see the results of this standardization depicted in number 6's graduation, in which number 2, still in his schoolmaster attire, is spinning a toy wheel contraption in a clockwise direction. This same gear-like toy was a prop in the first episode, Arrival, in the scene where number 6 goes to the Labor Department, and it appears later in the courtroom scene. But it is number 6 who's to be made into a cog of the machine, hence its suggestive presence in all of these instances. For many, radical questioning of the prevailing paradigm is unlikely to arise, but for others, accommodating the conventional norms can be extremely problematic. Many people are prone to psychological illnesses precisely because they are especially sensitive to conflicting messages from their environment, which lack any overall coherent pattern. In a very real sense, their psychic maladies are often accurate barometers for this greater lack of integration in society. Most are declared insane to some degree or another, and are treated accordingly to enable them to fit into an insane, sick society. The path of real growth, however, of the lone wolf, is a very painful one. Such a person who takes it does belong to the wilderness. It requires considerable courage. It is a road where one, for lengthy periods of time, becomes an outsider, forsaking the comforts of conventional supports. True personal growth beyond this linear mediocrity, is in fact a special kind of vocation. It's a calling, a rare gift, and those with it very likely have a personality profile which makes them especially vulnerable to the inherent conflicts of normal aspirations, and to those who aspire to and attempt to instill them. The term vocation is often diluted into being identified with conventionally defined roles. True vocation means breaking away from convention and embarking on an uncharted path in search of real freedom. Those who do this carry the process of cultural evolution forward, and often inspire others with deeper insights into finding their own potential. The person will develop a persona which is really an inauthentic, conscious, good self to present to the world. There is also the opposite, complementary, unconscious, bad shadow, hidden from the world. The latter is often misunderstood and unrecognized, and instead of being integrated with the self in a freer, authentic personality, it is frequently projected outwards upon others. In Jungianism, integration of the shadow is a key goal. However, it is rare that this is achieved except in a very limited way without substantial specialization of the unconscious process. And in our society, where our understanding rarely, if ever, goes beyond the linear level of consciousness, that is unlikely. The person now on the threshold of adulthood begins to seriously address the fundamental questions of life. The desire for freedom from mere role-playing and for greater authenticity becomes of paramount importance. One begins to desire to step out from one's own shadow and from society at large, to pursue goals in keeping with one's true personal needs. A period of disillusionment and restlessness can follow, involving considerable soul-searching. One must embark on the painful task of facing up to one's false self, and by coming to terms with his shadow self, learn to incorporate it into a more genuine persona. If successful, one learns to detach oneself from exclusive identification to one's ego with any particular stage of development. Thus one gains a higher freedom and can now see the value of the previous stages and achieve integration with them.
Why did you resign? What's this? Oh, come along, boy. Why did you resign?
From what, sir?
Now, my boy, you know perfectly well what I'm talking about. Why did you resign?
Oh, I can't tell you that, sir.
Was it secret?
Secret, sir?
And confidential?
No, sir.
Top secret?
No, sir.
Top secret?
State secret.
Yes.
State secret, sir.
Top state secret confidential. Why did you resign? All right, boy. All right, boy. Leave school, boy. Just tell me. No more school. Tell me, why did you resign?
If we look at it metaphorically, Number 6's violent reaction is not merely his now unconscious history of his resignation and life in the village as Number 6 coming to the surface, but in the context of the scene, it is evidence of the growing unconscious angst towards the system his former self was made to conform to, in essence, a state secret. Even at the linear conscious level, the unconscious, while serving the needs of the developed conscious structures, is still likely to overflow, as it were, preventing the formation and hold of a stable identity. When this happens, it is a clear signal that there is now a need to explicitly address the needs of the unconscious mind. However, initially, one having been trained in the opposite process will not be prepared to do this. Consequently, one will be on the onset of a severe existential crisis. One may now be at the stage on the threshold of adult life, with great prospects for the future. But instead of feeling content, optimistic, and enthusiastic, one begins to feel depressed, disillusioned, and disengaged, vaguely searching for a meaning that is not being provided by conventional pursuits. Initially, one may blame oneself for not being able to fit in and live up to prevailing expectations. However, if this crisis is genuine, adapting will be of no avail, and that existential guilt of living inauthentically will not only persist, but grow. Eventually, resolution can only be met by making major sacrifices and plunging into the unknown in the pursuit of authentic meaning. It is at the concrete and formal stages that we see the emergence of the superego, which represents a system of unconscious controls arising from early parent-child interaction. This blocks out unacceptable primitive affective responses, Sigmund Freud's id, and is both a necessary and inevitable development, as is the conscious differentiation of psychological structures or the ego. The child, learning, internalizes this process of repression, thus moving out of the pleasure principle and into what is known as the reality principle. This internalization of repression is inevitable, in that as the unconscious structures are as yet undifferentiated, it is not possible to properly integrate cognitive and affective development. However, this repression can be potentially damaging if psychological development does not go beyond the linear level and the specialization of conscious structures. When this is the case, while striving to exert conscious control over one's life, one becomes increasingly the victim of unconscious forces within. This complex is vividly portrayed in the boxing and fencing scenes, in which number 2 plays number 6's father.
Why? That's the way the money is. Why, Pop? Why, Pop?
Pop. Too much swing, boy. Too much swing. Keep down, keep short. Again. Good boy. Like this. Too much swing, boy. Swing's for kids, boy. You need the right, leave the left to sleep, boy. Hit me. Hook. Good, that's it, boy. Come on, boy, keep your left. I'll kill you, boy. What? I'll kill you, boy. Hit me. Take it easy, boy. You're the champ, boy. Take it easy, I made you. You're the champ, boy. The champ. Hey.
Pop. That's it, Lisa. Of course, Lisa. That's it, Lisa.
Tell me, boy, why did you resign, boy? Tell me, son. You're the champ, boy. The champ. Tell me, boy. Tell me, son. Why did you resign, boy? That's my boy. That's my boy. Touche. Light and easy, young man. No muscle. It's finesse. Good. Nice and easy. Good. But you ran. Mustn't run, young man. Don't hit and run. Don't treat it as a game, young man. The champ. Kill! Now. Kill! Afraid to prove you're a man. Your resignation was cowardice, wasn't it? No! Kill! The champ, boy. You can do it all, boy. You're the one-man band. You won't step over the threshold because you're scared. Go on. Kill! You missed, boy. You still can't do it.
Sorry.
Sorry? You're sorry for everybody. Is that why you resigned?
Both of these scenes are of number 6's father training him as a young man. Number 6's unconscious rage towards his father is made evident in the mirror structure he is experiencing. But that affective mode is ultimately neutralized after it comes to the surface at the end of the fencing scene, as number 2 chastises him for not being able to do anything right. In both the fencing and boxing scenes, there is an outletting of this unconscious rage, but it is given a channel to express itself that is non-lethal, in that number 2 is protected with padding in the boxing scene, and the foils have tips upon them in the fencing scene. His purpose in these scenes are to dull down number 6's aggression with the most familiar representation of his superego, his father. After number 6 lunges the foil and misses number 2, the tip comes off. In essence, the restraints of his unconscious anger have been lifted. But in the scenes that follow, however, that dulling of the effective response has resumed, as we see number 6 in the world, this time at a restaurant for a job interview. Where the conscious cognitive approach dominates, there is a continual dulling of the effective response. After the scenes with number 6's father, he is far more repressed in his thinking and actions. In our Western culture, there is a rift between the cognitive and affective modes. The sciences, for instance, with their exclusive identification with reason, the cognitive mode, have become impersonal, handicapping the capacity for wonder and awe in understanding. The drive is one towards impersonal universality, without any personal uniqueness. Because of this imbalance, a drive for emotional fulfillment often leads to the pursuit of fleeting compensatory pleasures. Hence, the following scenes are of number 6 pursuing a career in a bank, which is actually a cover for intelligence. Number 6 gets a job as a secret agent, and thus gets all the perks that such a job has to offer. But he is still not happy or fulfilled.
It is approved and passed into the minutes.
Yes, sir. I'd like a job.
You have it.
Thank you.
Just a minute!
Close the door. Come in. Come in. Come in. Come in. Just one slight matter. Yes. We've been watching you. Eh? Yes, you're just right.
Right for you?
Yes, of course. My dear boy, you don't expect a man of your talents would be wasted in licking stamps, do you?
Never.
Never. No, you're with us.
Till death do us part.
Exactly.
This is a cover.
Exactly.
For
Secret.
good.
This is a cover.
For secret.
Secret work.
Top. Secret. Confidential job. Thank you.
This pursuit is also illustrated in the setting itself. The mobile room of the embryo serves not only as a high-end restaurant and number 6's apartment flat, but it is also a jail and a POW camp. If the penny-farthing bicycle of the village was, according to Patrick McGoohan, a symbol of progress, then we may assume that the pictures of the steam engines on the back wall of the room are symbolic of the evolution of modernity, as is the room itself. The pictures of horse riders on the left wall also give the room a feeling of class and culture. In a later scene, number 2 enthusiastically tells number 6 about its modern amenities. But it is, after all, still just a prison, and number 6 wants to know what's behind it. The subtlety of the question being lost on number 2.
built-in bars.
Also, self-contained. Kitchen. Bathroom. Air conditioning. Food supplies for 6 months. You'd go anywhere in it. It even has a waste disposal unit.
It moves.
It's detachable.
What's behind it?
Steel.
One who enters the circular level undergoes many existential crises. Though not recognized directly at first, during these, significant growth of mirror or negative structures take place, challenging the surface consciousness and leading one to ask fundamental questions about the meaning of life. Disillusionment with conventional social attitudes and expectations lead to a search for a more authentic approach. One is likely to feel that they're alone in the darkness, without knowing where to run. This painful, uncertain experience is the means by which the ego is slowly weaned from unsatisfactory roots of fulfillment.
Just to bring matters up to date, why exactly do you want this job?
That's a job. No, there isn't at all. No. You have no respect for tradition. Pardon? No respect for tradition for an old established firm of bankers.
I was very good at mathematics.
Oh, so we all. Otherwise we wouldn't be in it, would we?
I don't mean that.
What do you mean?
Well, I mean, I can work.
Can you what hours?
Why, I don't care.
Why?
Well, it's the way I'm made.
Oh, excellent.
Are you ready? Come on.
Ready for what?
Hurry up.
I know what I'm ready for.
Come on. Why, you have to meet our managing director. Why am I?
In the scenes following number 2's portrayal as number 6's father, in which number 6 gets a job as a secret agent, we see this disillusionment begin. After each success, we do not see him becoming happier with his life choices, but more and more miserable. Eventually, in a manner which always remains elusive and mysterious and completely personal, the crisis is finally resolved through a movement and commitment to a higher level of reality. This resolution is often referred to as illumination or enlightenment. For a long period, there is a marked struggle between the ego pursuits associated with the linear level, pleasure, recognition, achievement, etc., and the emerging spiritual characteristics of the higher levels. The resolution of this conflict can happen suddenly and dramatically. Like a deep well, the waters of the unconscious rush to the surface, free-flowing to the surface of consciousness and nourishing it with new meaning. The root of anxiety lies in the fear of loss, and ultimately in the fear of death itself. This fear is well-based, and consequently all meaning in life is experienced in the shadow of the seeming non-meaning of death. The function of ego attachments is ambiguous. From a conscious perspective, they are temporary havens which dispel the immediate fear of death. This, however, only diverts the primal fear to the unconscious, where it lurks as an invincible enemy, prepared to sabotage all our best efforts to evade it. At this stage, escape from this primal existential anxiety is impossible. The usual lines of defense, the conscious structures, are stripped. One is alone in the dark, without shelter, at the mercy of the wild beasts of fear, which have escaped from the unconscious. This can be quite a harrowing experience. For no reason at all, it seems, one finds himself living in a waking nightmare. No action taken helps to relieve the situation, because the dynamics of the changes taking place originate deep from the unconscious. The aids of friends, lovers, or guides offer little to no value, and can even magnify one's distress. These transitions often take place when one would be expecting to realize their ambitions and have a foothold on their life. Instead, one is inexplicably damned to a strange underworld. Nervous breakdowns occur. There is chronic anxiety and severe loss of confidence. All hell seems to break loose within the person. Immunity to psychological weaknesses in the psyche is low. Neurotic elements of the personality surface and are magnified, due to the erosion of one's former structures. Neurosis betrays an unwillingness to face reality. The neurotic person clings to a false view of their life. The pain of attempting fundamental change in the neurotic is seen as too great, and so much energy is invested in protecting the defenses of the fearful ego. It is usually only in crisis situations, where one is sufficiently humbled through pain and suffering, that genuine change is possible. Anxiety and depression are the two most common ills that plague modern life. Ultimately, these are both, at bottom, existential problems, where meaning is threatened by non-meaning, and life itself is threatened by death. Normally, the full existential content is masked and made less intense through a process of localization into a specific fear. Phobias, which can be to a proportion which is cripplingly severe, are an extreme expression of this tendency, as are obsessions and superstitions. By over-identifying anxiety with a specific fear, one unconsciously attempts to leave other areas of life free of anxiety. However, due to the total removal of conscious defenses in this stage, there is no escape from the anxiety in its root form. One must face up willingly to their anxiety. This resolution means confronting its root fear of annihilation. When one experiences reality from a linear perspective, there is an inevitable tendency to seek life and avoid death, which are seen as opposites. Because this is a fundamental distortion, it increases the fear of what one is trying desperately to avoid. The seeking to possess finite phenomena, whether physical or psychological, reduces real freedom, for the more one possesses, the greater the corresponding fear of loss. All life involves death. Death, in turn, leads to life. The approach that reconciles these poles is essentially one of non-possession. The paradox being that by striving to possess nothing, one becomes free to possess all things in a spiritual sense. Anxiety can serve as a catalyst for the very transformation that is required. The discomfort and unease in someone with severe anxiety is not ignorable, but sharply distressing. One feels pulled in different directions with no respite. The word anxiety is close to the Latin word for narrow. There is a terrible inner constriction caused by this conflict, where one feels as if the very breath of life is being stifled. This, however, can greatly increase the desire for necessary integration. Number 6, after getting a job as a secret agent, is soon arrested for speeding, and this begins the court scene. Number 6 is now on trial. But the trial is for more than just speeding. It is a mirror structure for number 6's unconscious existential guilt.
I am very good. I'm no angel. I'm very good at mathematics.
2 and 2.
4.
Congratulations.
Ask the manager.
Manager?
The bank manager. He knows I'm good at figures.
How many dead?
What?
You were driving at great speed.
Yes, but nobody was hurt.
In a restricted zone.
Oh, I had to.
Had to?
Yes. I have a reason.
Good. Good. Tell me the reason.
I was on a mission. Matter of life or death.
Life or death, eh?
Yes.
Whose life or death?
Not allowed to say.
Why?
It was secret business.
Confidential.
State confidential.
Of the highest order.
Yes.
International. State. Secret business.
Yes, yes, indeed.
Tell me.
Can't.
Can't?
Such business is above the law.
Above the law?
Above the law, yes.
Tell me.
Never.
You're guilty.
Yes?
Of speeding. On a public highway. No excuses.
One of the reasons one can feel so wretched is because the illumination one is experiencing reveals the depth of misery within. The pure interior light highlights, by contrast, all the imbalances and vain ego desires. It's a knowledge of one's innate moral guilt that becomes a greater burden than any other problem. Although spiritual illumination may be perceived of as gnosis, which brings joy, expanse, and transcendent wholeness, it also brings pain and suffering. In other words, there's the well-known positive illumination and the negative, purgative illumination. The sharp shock experience of purgation forces one into a radical reappraisal of all one's basic assumptions, enabling one to more freely break from his internal bonds. Underlying everyday life is a chorus of self-doubt and self-questioning, which, sooner or later, can bring one face to face with the meaning of life. This self-questioning always comes with a kind of existential dread, a sense of insecurity, of loss, exile, and sin. One senses that he has been untrue, not to abstract moral or social norms, but to one's inmost truth. This dread is not simply a fear of retribution. It is a profound awareness that one is in ultimate bad faith with himself and is living a lie.
Guilty.
Unrestricted murder on the public highways. Thinks he knows it all. Too fast. Why do you risk the murder of an innocent human being by exceeding the speed limit?
Good at figures.
Don't you like it?
I'll work any hours of the day.
Fine 20 units.
I appeal.
What?
I appeal.
Not allowed.
I can't pay.
20 units?
I can't pay.
Nothing.
The units are not for me.
You are a member of the village. No! You are a unit
No!
of society. No! Contempt.
No.
Contempt of court.
I accept the ruling. Thank you.
6 days in jail.
I was rebelling, my lord.
6 days.
I was rebelling against the figures, my lord.
6 days. Take him away.
I was rebelling, my lord.
6 days. Take him away. I feel my lord. 6 days. I appeal. You are getting the same treatment. Appeal against unfair treatment. You're getting the same treatment as everybody else. But that's why I'm going to appeal. There's an appeal against unfair treatment. Why? Why not resign? I am not a member. I am not a unit of society.
Number 2, playing a magistrate and demanding number 6 to acknowledge himself as a unit of society, encapsulates the existential struggle between man and society. Its institutional, organized, approved way may in fact encourage us into living in falsity and illusion. Number 6's explicit dread has roots in this inner conflict. In order to be true to himself, he must break with familiar, established, and secure norms and go off into the unknown. The scene serves a dual function in not only illustrating the point in number 6's history when he may have decided to resign as a secret agent, but helping him to get to the heart of the matter, which wasn't resolved merely with his resignation. This is evident in his final lines in the scene before the fade-out, in which he manically begins to ask himself why he resigned, as if he himself did not truly know the reason. The entry into the prison of the embryo room marks an even more restrictive phase of degree absolute, but it can also be seen as metaphorical for number 6's state of mind. He is rebelling now, instead of submitting to the demands of society and living in what Sartre called bad faith. However, he is still prisoner to the society he is rebelling from. In the circular level, one is constantly attempting to balance extremes. The existentialist's iconoclastic position cannot be sustained indefinitely. Though being an outsider, one still remains a member of society. One must develop an outward perspective and be involved in society. This is the development of a negative sense structure. Rather than avoiding and running away from unpleasant situations, one consciously faces up to them. This active purgation is different from the more unconscious passive purgation, in which one runs the danger of losing touch with reality. In this form, there is an easing of purgation and a feeling of imminent release. After a period of intense ordeal in this underworld, one begins to gradually adapt more successfully. He is still enclosed in darkness and endures much, but it is now in a much more resigned and peaceful manner. There is now the emergence of new superstructures which are intensely experienced and sharply focused, related to the internal senses. There is now an appreciation of the relativity of every human psychological situation. This is the essence of the existentialist dilemma portrayed by writers such as Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, and Heidegger. It is the development of an internal worldview, of an objective moral order. One intensely feels the scaffolding of conventional wisdom, which constricts and reduces one's personal freedom, collapsing all around them. One is alone, and must find his own way of survival. What he finds is a discovery of his own special uniqueness as an individual. He finds the power to choose, to genuinely decide, free of second-hand information, what constitutes true meaning for the self. In decision, one develops the freedom to choose, to accept or to reject in accordance with a deep, innate sense of personal truth. Any decision involves a dynamic interaction between the internal subject and the object event involved. It's neither the internal response nor the external event in isolation that constitutes meaning. Rather, it's the dynamic relationship involving both. There's a danger of never having absolute certainty in the circumstances of any decision. But existentially, this uncertainty is what gives a decision value. The leap of faith, as Kierkegaard termed it. It's only in the presence of doubt that a meaningful existential decision can be made. In fact, it is the presence of the unknown that is necessary in all life to enable growth. The leap of faith seeks to unify the two conflicting poles, objective and subjective factors, of the moral situation into a unified experience of pure intuition. Indeed, existential faith is born out of uncertainty and represents this seeking for peace of mind and higher unity through direct transcendence of phenomena. It also necessitates the experience of the unknown. It is simply intuition exercised in darkness. This authentic faith is the means of sharpening one's intuitive capacity and transcending ego attachments. The veracity of this faith inevitably implies the freedom to continually question beliefs not in keeping with authentic experience.
All the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances, and one man in his time plays many parts. Is Act B, 7 Ages.
Before I continue with the narrative of Once Upon a Time, I want to say something more about the setting and how it relates to the concept of psychological mirroring. In dynamic terms, physical and psychological reality are fully complementary. The specialized conscious tends to separate them and treat them as unrelated. Through the development of intuition, that interrelatedness of the physical and psychological domains can be appreciated. A translational approach combines reason and intuition so as to formulate the basic physical and psychological processes in such a way that their underlying complementarity can be understood. In physics, it's believed that matter is complemented by what is called antimatter. Any matter particle is formally identical with its antimatter counterpart of an opposite charge. So theoretically, an antimatter universe would be similar to a matter universe, its relationship being that each has opposite characteristics from the other. Normally, the two are clearly separated. However, when brought into contact, mutual annihilation transpires, creating physical energy. It is the same in psychic terms. All conscious understanding at an external level is complemented by conscious understanding at an internal level. We can define external objective existence as being of psychic matter with a positive charge, and internal subjective experience as psychic antimatter with a negative charge. Grasping this has enormous importance. Every fact, concept, theory, or hypothesis has a corresponding anti-fact, anti-concept, anti-theory, or anti-hypothesis. which are formally identical but opposite in direction when related dynamically. What this means is that in dynamic terms, all understanding involves a dialogue between the subjective self and the objective world. We can view understanding in complementary ways involving the world in relation to the self, or the self in relation to the world. If we think of the world as psychic matter, then the self involves psychic antimatter. Linear conscious activity will interpret both poles of understanding as positive. Objective and subjective then becomes rigid and seen as separate from one another. What is necessary is a mirror understanding between the poles, lest one be experienced without much actual interaction between these two poles. Mirror understanding arises from an understanding of the underlying complementarity of both subjective and objective experience. Before switching between the poles of experience takes place, consciousness is negated and undone. This in turn makes the role of the unconscious more explicit and greatly facilitates the dynamic interaction of the poles, generating a new understanding, a fusion between psychic matter and psychic antimatter. This, in a nutshell, is what we see in the darkness and abstractia of Once Upon a Time. Number 6's consciousness has been undone, and in this mirror world, his unconscious content is coming to the fore, providing an opportunity for him to confront it. We should also note that the title of the episode is Once Upon a Time, and time is experienced as both linear and circular in the episode. In one scene, Number 6 is reliving a portion of his life as a graduate from school. Sometime later, he is back on a rocking horse learning his ABCs, and all within the time frame of a week. In short, time has been reduced to a single present moment. In a physical matter world, time moves in a forward direction only. By contrast, in a physical antimatter world, space and time relatively move backwards. This is why matter and antimatter cannot coexist. In a real sense, the creation of energy involves the canceling out of matter in a forward and backward moving space and time, generating an immediate present reality, degree absolute. It is the same in psychological terms. Objective and subjective experience takes place in systems of space and time, which are actually opposite in relation to each other. When experiencing space and time objectively, one moves forward in a psychic matter world. When experiencing space and time subjectively, it moves forward in what is, by contrast, an antimatter world. However, in relation to each other, space and time are moving in opposite directions. And when there is a directional interaction, the conflict becomes apparent. Thus, when one tries to harmonize the opposite directions of external and internal experience, positive and negative movements tend to annihilate each other, leading to the growth of psychic or spiritual energy existing outside space and time in a continually present moment. A highly spiritual person lives essentially in the present. When external activity draws such a person forward in space and time, it is counterbalanced by an inner subjective experience, moving the person in a reverse backward direction. Thus the movements in space and time are cancelled out in an ever-present moment. For the person living at the conventional linear level, these dynamics are greatly limited because the two-way process of understanding is continually interpreted in reduced static terms, and so a very limited fusion of psychic matter and antimatter takes place in their experience, and their worldview is never seriously questioned. Most people's conviction is still that matter exists out there, independent of the mind. This is what one would expect from a linear understanding. However, some individuals in which the unconscious activity runs on a higher level begin to see the grave distortions in the linear manner of understanding. When this mirroring begins, there is a dynamic reversal of fortune. One becomes plunged into darkness, and everything starts restricting to the confines of the self. Because conscious phenomena are significantly eroded through spiritual fusion, no matter how one tries, one seems to achieve less and less in conscious terms. Indeed, because memory contents are also being wiped out and past achievements cannot sustain one. The mirror reverse structures are vitally important in terms of the dynamic of personality growth. They represent a form of psychic antimatter that is directly complementary to the antimatter of the physical universe. Whereas psychic structures enable one to posit and identify with conscious phenomena, the psychic anti-structures, or mirror structures, enable one to negate or undo and thereby disidentify with that phenomena. Relative to its psychic matter counterpart, everything in a psychic antimatter world, the movement of space and time, is of the opposite direction. Neither world can coexist when brought into contact. Therefore, when structure and anti-structure activity is fused in a balanced manner, considerable generation of a new psychic energy results. There are no longer any polarities. Like physical light, it is its own antimatter. The room itself is underneath the green dome, and is itself circular. As opposed to the linear level, the circular level is sometimes referred to as the subtle realm. It is characterized by an increasing emphasis on unconscious development and involves the differentiation and specialization of the unconscious processes. When undifferentiated, unconscious experience remains at the level of mere instinct. But with sufficient differentiation, however, it becomes transformed into intuitive insight. At the linear level, there are various stages in this growth resulting in the development of new structures, which we may refer to as superstructures. In contrast to the active structures of the conscious process, these are more refined and may be referred to as passive structures. These superstructures are based on the developing unconscious process and its generation of intuitive insight. They must, however, be translated into a conscious format. Also, even though consciousness has become more refined and subtle, there is still an attempt to keep intuitive development under rational control. We may refer to this newfound superior use of reason as the emergence of a higher consciousness or overmind. The descent involves entry into a nonlinear internal world. There is the development of mirror structures in the psyche. Here the usual identity of symbols tends to fade and they become charged with a transcendent archetypal meaning. Experience of movement, external in space and time, becomes increasingly relative. There is an inevitable conflict between a growing holistic spiritual aspiration and the ego-centered habits and psychological makeup, which creates a crisis point. What comes of this is the development of supersensory mirror or anti-structures in relation to the external senses. To use the terms of St. John of the Cross in his description of the dark night of the soul, we may refer to this descent as the night of sense. These mirror or anti-structures serve to cancel out the one-sided possessive identification with phenomena. We saw before the stages where sensory structures generate ego attachments, and supersensory structures which generate a more subtle identification with the universal archetypal significance. The anti-structure development brings about a U-turn in the experience of reality. Whereas one has lived psychologically in a universe capable of expansion without limit, now that universe is sharply contracting, seemingly to be contained within the internal psyche. One finds himself in an extremely contracted environment in which one scarcely has room enough to breathe. This is because the experience has switched from the positive direction of events moving forward in space and time to a negative direction where they move backwards. Normally one switches from one conscious pole of experience to another, which is also experienced as conscious. From conscious objective to conscious subjective experience, both positive poles. However, the unconscious is considerably involved in mirror structure development. Because ego consciousness is undone here, instead of switching from one conscious pole of experience to another, there is rather a central fusion of opposites. This fusion is not a pleasant experience, but in fact a very painful one.
This delightful residence is known as the embryo room. In it, you can relive from the cradle
pages of man. William Shakespeare.
Last scene of all that ends this strange, eventful history is second childishness and mere oblivion.
Sans eyes,
Yeah.
sans teeth,
Yeah.
sans taste,
Yes.
sans everything.
Mathematics inherently involves a dynamic interaction between mind and matter. A purely linear conceptualization of mathematics is bound to be reduced and distorted. Number 6 says in the job interview scene that he's very good at mathematics, and he repeats this later on when he's in front of a judge for speeding. This is not a throwaway line, because it reflects his psyche as it has been acclimatized to living on the linear level, and the subsequent conflict within him. Notice also the way he delivers the statement. Heisenberg's uncertainty principle tells us that the more certain you are of one thing, the more uncertain you are of the other. Reason and intuition are essentially two modes in all understanding, but we tend to achieve greater clarity in one mode at the expense of the other.
Alternating even numbers. What? Test. Alternating even numbers. Go.
2, 4,
2, 4.
4,
6,
4,
4, 6.
2, 4,
5, 6, 5, 6, 5, 2, 4, 6.
That's me.
2, 4, 6, that's you. 6, you are 6.
Alternating even numbers. Go. 2, 4, 6, 8.
The presence of numbers in the court scene is relevant to this point as well. Number 6 is commanded to recite all alternating even numbers, starting from 2, which he cannot do. Reason is tautological, making explicit what is already implied in the assumptions. Without an intuitive ability to see that the results deduced by reason are already implicit in the assumptions, one would not be able to comprehend any logical proposition. It is intuition, not reason, which is required for this implicit recognition. Number 6's inability in this scene and others to say the number 6, his number in the village, is his intuition attempting to override his reason. The intuitive approach places a strong emphasis on implicit recognition. It can see directly what is implied by assumption, with very little need for explicit rational guidance. The rational approach, however, highly relies on the explicit and logical demonstration. When one leans too far in the rational extreme, they become rigid and narrow. And when one leans too far in the intuitive extreme, as depicted in the earlier rocking horse scene, they can become too loose and vague, without any means of effective communication. From a dynamic perspective, each number has a value that can be posited through the simultaneous active negation of all other numbers. If I consider the number 6 in dynamic terms, this implies negating or excluding 4, 5, 7, etc. In this sense, there's relativity. The number 6 is finitely determined against a background of all other numbers. These excluded numbers remain finitely indeterminate. Thus, the one involves the whole. The concept of number is not any specific number, but rather the potential for existence of all possible numbers. In this sense, the concept relates directly to the infinite rather than the finite. In an earlier scene, after number 6's graduation, with him again regressed to a child in the early concrete stages, we see him still in touch with the infinite. The potential number concept is posited dynamically through the negation or exclusion of any actual number. Thus, the positing of the potential number concept is the reverse procedure of positing actual numbers. Understanding is provided by reason, and potential understanding by intuition. The actual relates to the finite domain, and the potential to the infinite domain, which are quantitatively different. All this considered, we can see that numbers have a dual existence. The linear perspective, however, as depicted in the scene with number 2 reprising his role as a schoolmaster with slitted glasses, gravely reduces and eliminates altogether the intuitive understanding, which leads to a finite reduction of the infinite. The infinite, thus, being incorrectly seen as an extension of the finite, The circular perspective sees the number system in relative terms as finite but unbounded.
A, B, C, D, E, Salem.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
6,
5.
6, 5, 6, 5, 6, 5, 6, 5, 6, 5, 6, 1, 6, 1, 6, 5, 6,
5.
6, 1, 6, 1, 6, 1, 6, 1. Up does the other.
Pop goes the whistle. Pop, 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 pop,
Pop, pop, pop,
pop,
pop,
pop.
pop, protect,
Protect,
protect, pop, pop, protect,
pop.
protect other people.
Protect.
Peoples and protection.
Protect other pop.
Protect other people.
We see this clash between these two perspectives in the seemingly random banter between number 2 and number 6 in this scene. Pop, in this sense, could be an allusion to the Big Bang and hence the infinite, or to this conflict itself, in addition to being an informal noun for father. The linear perspective views its psychic constructions as reality, mistaking the photograph for the actual place, so to speak. It may ask why, but it expects an answer in accordance with its own mode of understanding. So far be it from accurately representing reality, these psychic constructs, through an inherent reductionism, misrepresent true reality, which remains mysterious and elusive. With the intuitive perspective, however, it's the reverse. All perceptions are understood as dynamically opposed to their corresponding concepts, and it is this opposition which makes interaction between the two possible. The presence again of the spotlight in the scene is a symbol of transcendence, and it appears many times in the drama. Ultimately, attainment of true knowledge involves a transcendence of all concepts and perceptions. Returning to Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, we see that it is inevitably bound up with any psychic structures we use to model reality. It is in the spontaneous outbursts of the other that the uncertainty principle manifests itself. In this case, number 6's intuitive aversion to his number against number 2's development of mental constructs. What we're seeing is the child participating in creating his own understanding of reality. With the higher intuitive understanding, the appropriate means for rationally interpreting physical reality is possible. Once Upon a Time shows us the stages of childhood development, the existential problems of life in the modern world, and even has much to bear on the topic of psychological mirroring. But there is still yet another interpretation. We may see the episode as number 6 going through the mystical process known as the dark night of the soul. The dark night of the soul is probably the most critical of all stages on the transcendent journey. It is a testing unlike any which has preceded it, and of the longest duration. The type of psychological suffering unique to this stage have no parallels in normal life. By its nature, it goes to the roots of the unconscious personality. It can be obscure and baffling, and near impossible to adequately communicate. More than any other stage, it can only be properly understood through direct experience. The entry to it follows a long and unsuccessful battle to integrate positive super-rational experience from previous stages. Internal conflict increases, and one is led to the need for a radical transformation of self. At each stage of the mystical journey, new vision is acquired, and one feels closer to their vocation in life finally becoming realized. However, these new structures inevitably lead to ego attachments, which clashes with authentic spiritual desire. Joy gives way to discontent, and ultimately one reaches a crisis point, which can only be resolved through renouncing the very gifts one has come to cherish. The dark night goes to the very core of the personality. It involves a renewed purgation of all earlier developed structures, so there is nothing in conscious understanding that is left untouched. For one with a more cerebral bent, this overturning is especially difficult. One seems to be erasing the very essence of one's being. With nowhere to go, one surrenders both cognitive and affective psychological modes. Quite quite literally, all positive conscious understanding is undone through a corresponding negative mirror structure. This part of the journey, if successfully traveled, culminates in a fusion of both. In mystical literature, this undoing of conscious understanding is referred to as the cloud of unknowing, or learned ignorance, conveying this mirror structure development.
A find missing link. When I found it, I will refine it and tune it, and you will play our game. We put it together. And if I fail, then
at the start of the week, number 2 writes on a chalkboard his intent in front of an infantile number 6, declaring that he will find the missing link. The missing link is the unconscious content which the mirror structures of the dark night are meant to bring to the surface. The second declaration is that he will put number 6 back together in a manner that he desires. Number 2 then writes the word bang, saying it will be the consequence if he fails to do so. This could have multiple meanings. It could mean that one of them will die, or that he will die later at the hands of his superiors. It could even foreshadow the missile launch in the following episode. However, another interpretation could be that if number 6 successfully transverses the dark night of the soul, if he finds the missing link and puts himself back together, he will be spiritually transformed as a direct result of overcoming the subsequent difficulties of personal integration, renewed and imbued with a new living energy, the psychological equivalent of a Big Bang. What happens during the dark night is the structures of the personality collapse under a massive internal gravitational pull. No light can escape. There is a prolonged darkness. Conscious communication becomes difficult. In essence, all experience is driven inward. Anyone who has gone through such a period will recognize the one-way subjective direction of experience. One endures a psychological congestion and contraction, which finally expands outward again. The title of the episode, Once Upon a Time, implies fantasy, an imaginary world. If we look at it through a dynamic dual approach, as both number 6's cognitive and imaginary experience, we can see the dynamic interaction of these modes resembling parallel universes. In other words, we have the real world which we, the audience, see, and we have the imaginary parallel universe which number 6 sees. And we should not take it for granted that, though imaginary, what number 6 is seeing is as real to him as our world is to us. These two parallel universes intersect in the drama and are given physical expression. What this simply amounts to in practical terms is that each person's experience of reality is unique, constituting a single dynamic universe. And this universe interacts in common experience with those of others, like intersecting parallel universes. The dark night of the soul is a gateway to an infinite number of parallel universes. The death of the real and the dimensions of space and time simultaneously involves the birth of imaginary matter and imaginary dimensions. In physical terms, it is a transition from a relativistic universe to a quantum one. Once upon a time also implies time reversal. In the story, we're told degree absolute will be a week long, but we can assume that number 6's mirror experience couldn't be bracketed within any duration of time. Space and time move in a forward direction in positive structures. In the corresponding negative or mirror structures, they move backwards. The dark night culminates mirror structure development, wherein all positive movement in space and time are negated and undone, as are the very dimensions themselves. This is why the dark night experience may feel so tightly congested. It is because one is being squeezed out of not only the movement of events within space and time, but from experiencing these dimensions altogether. St. John of the Cross often referred to this psychological congestion as an extreme narrowing experienced by the soul, and used the biblical reference of Jonah being swallowed up by the whale to illustrate this. The dark night is so radical in experience and transformation that one abandons a space-time framework entirely, moving into a purely spiritual and eternal present experience of reality. St. John of the Cross spoke of two spiritual nights, the night of sense, which involves external structures, and the night of spirit, which involves both external and internal structures. He spoke of these nights very much as psychological event horizons. At the end of the event horizon is a kind of singularity. The goal of the dark night is to be reduced to nada, or nothing, referred to in the East as the void, so as to arrive at the pure spiritual center of one's being. The dark night is likely to be characterized from the offset as a dramatic bewilderment which has no parallel to any other experience. One is thrust into an extremely dark, oppressive inner environment, and must carry on without support as bravely as possible. The most significant emotional feeling one experiences through this dark night is that of profound grief. Due to the erosion of conscious structures and contents involved, there is a continuously reinforced sense of loss. The ultimate loss is of life itself. Grief associated with loss tends to make one aware of one's separate, isolated identity, and it is in this state of vulnerability that we see number 6 in throughout the episode. This is not the same person we've seen up to this point. However, as earth-shattering as this dark night process is, despite all of the pain, one finds the dark totally absorbing. And because of the level of spiritual fusion possible, the overall experience conveys a profound degree of authentic meaning. This may only become apparent in the aftermath of the most intense trials, wherein, having survived from the worst moments of crisis, one is in closest contact with a strong, invisible presence. When one re-enters the world after this process, because of the rapid spiritual growth one has undergone, one's sensitivity to the imperfections in oneself and in other people is vastly magnified.
How?
Don't do that.
What?
Inquire.
What's your number?
What?
Your number. What is it?
Be careful.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7,
Quiet.
8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15.
One beginning on the dark night will have already risen to an extent beyond the linear level of existence and found it unfulfilling to authentic spiritual growth. Generally, one entering the dark night has already accumulated considerable experience of the genuine difficulties which await the person on the spiritual journey, and will have prepared a kind of capacity to transverse it. Number 2, reviewing number 6's progress report at the start of the episode, is showing us this. Number 6, up to this point, has foiled most of the village's attempts to break him, and will now have to face the ultimate test. However, as one finds himself plunged into darkness, facing a new, unfamiliar set of trials, nothing can adequately prepare him for the sheer, unrelenting intensity of what will unfold. Many of the hallmarks of the Dark Night experience can be found throughout the episode. The first one being the most obvious, night. This is one of the most commonly used symbols. Night, with its connotations of darkness, is used to denote the unconscious. In archetypal myths, to venture into it is to enter a period of intense unconscious activity, which is experienced in great darkness. The night itself is the time span of this transcendent journey through the unconscious. Dusk symbolizing the initial differentiation of unconscious structures, and dawn symbolizing the ending of this period, this stage is the most intense point, midnight. In the night, there can be an experience of peace, serenity, and intimacy. Although one remains in darkness, there are moments of tranquil contemplation, where one feels at peace, supported by an intimate, invisible presence. This can be found in the episode In the Spotlight, which is shown during key points in the story, which has a moon-like look to it. We can also sense a kind of presence in the swing set and rocking horse, which are always moving, even when no one is on or near them. However, these could just as well be seen as the movements of a negative presence. One often experiences fear and a sense of danger lurking around him. Without warning, peace can suddenly be shattered and become a profound sense of dread and unease. The dividing line between nature and spirit is especially thin during this period, and the pure spiritual communication experienced directly is complemented by an exposure to one's imperfections. And unlike in the day, one cannot hide those in shadow, for that which is in shadow now confronts one directly. The underground is another common and powerfully evocative symbol of the unconscious. One becoming committed to a secret cause, or in the mystical context, a life of inner contemplation, goes into the earth and away from normal life to a world very much hidden from other people. The underground can also be a very sinister place, full of shadowy, odd happenings. Normal interactions in relationships tend to break down, and seemingly innocuous events become charged with strong omens of evil. People who mean well may cause one deep inner pain. Chance utterances can become filled with profound significance of a special personal meaning. One often feels like a hostage imprisoned underground, in a kind of hell, with no hope of salvation. There is an extreme level of contraction in one's environment, as if one is bound hand and foot. There is a feeling where one is suffocating, scarcely able to breathe. It can be likened also to the desert, another common symbol of the dark night. Although desert implies expansive landscapes, a wasteland would more aptly describe it. A desert that is vast and featureless with no signs of life. One treads a solitary path that continues without end. One's conscious life has now dried up, and one feels internally barren and deprived. One also loses the ability to gain any satisfaction from normal activity. The white horse is an ancient symbol that features in the pantheons of numerous cultures, such as Greek, Celtic, Norse, Slavic, Native American, Judaism, Zoroastrianism, Christianity, Hinduism, Islam, and Buddhism. It typically delivers the hero or god figure to triumph over negative forces. For instance, Siddhartha made his great departure upon Kantaka, his white horse, which carried him across a great river, symbolizing him leaving the world of the body. Pegasus, whose name means springs of ocean, was born of the sea god Poseidon and the Gorgon Medusa. When Perseus cut off Medusa's head, Pegasus was born from the blood which fell into the sea. The white horse is a symbol of purified passion and transcendence, which relates to the conscious effort to gain control over the turbulent waters of the deep unconscious. The white horse is also a personification of raw nature and the desire for freedom. So it's very fitting to see number 6 upon a white rocking horse in the episode. Notice too that the horse is always moving in nearly every scene, as if it has a life of its own, straining to jump clear of its rockers into a whole new path of being that it only suspects is there, much like number 6. Symbols of elevation are used to illustrate the transcendent journey of the dark night. One of the most common is the mountain and its dangerous ascent. St. John of the Cross entitled his most comprehensive book on the dark night, The Ascent of Mount Carmel. To scale a treacherous peak requires a great deal of courage. It's a very lonely and potentially dangerous journey. Few may make it to the top, with many either turning back or falling off along the way. But those who do reach the top gain an enhanced view of all creation, and come down again with a desire to climb even higher peaks. Other symbols of elevation, such as the ladder and stairs, are also symbols of the transcendent climb. In all instances, to mount one's step, one must first have some footing in some degree of phenomenal structures of understanding, which as one ascends, becomes more intuitive and refined. Only at the top, in pure comprehension of the Absolute, can this ladder or staircase be discarded. It can often seem as if one is walking a tightrope which divides heaven and hell. One seems in perpetual danger of falling off and being swallowed up by chaos or the void. And there's never any room for complacency. One must act quickly. It's not unusual for the weather to reflect this death experience, sometimes cold, dark, and wet. In spiritual terms, this is very much a winter season. In its spiritual storms, one is beset by all kinds of disturbances and afflictions. One is tossed about and battered, perhaps even struck internally, as if by a bolt of lightning. The dark night of the soul, culminating in a transcendent spirituality, can be likened to a journey. One sets out, or more often is forced via circumstance, beyond the ego's desires and on a quest for truth. Ultimately, when the full cycle has been completed, one arrives back at one's starting point, albeit in a purified state. At this point of the journey, one is approaching the northern polar region of the soul, which brings the attainment of the transcendent extreme. The journey then turns southward, symbolizing a more eminent development. Number 6 at the end of the week is escorted by the supervisor out of the embryo room to an elevator, which takes him down further to discover the identity of number 1 in the following episode, completing the journey of his dark night. To the extent which light disappears externally, it shines internally. The dark night leads to the development of an inner illumination, which occurs in the darkness of spirit. This can be seen as an internal sun, or a phoenix which has risen from the ashes of the old self. Generally, the quality and intensity of this illumination depends on the quality and intensity of the painful inpouring during the preceding purgative stages. One emerges, after the severity of the dark night, purer, lighter in weight, wiser than before, and deeper in the conviction of an experienced truth. As one transverses the dark night, a gradual unfolding of a new internal stage takes place, what we may term superrational, negative, or subjective structures. Whereas the previous positive objective structures are of a global positive quality, these relate to detailed, localized personal decisions. In the drama, we see the holistic external understanding in a positive direction in number 6's comments to number 2 in the court scene about being more than just a unit. In the following peace of mind scene, it has turned to a specific internal understanding in a negative direction. Put another way, during this existentially charged stage, decisions are largely related to emotional feeling, based on a subtle, intuitively refined, rational approach. The superrational negative structure is, in essence, number 6 reliving the conditions of his resignation. One still remains in the dark, but now has a faint light to guide him, an internal operation of cognition of a superrational kind. What this is, in plain terms, is an extremely intuitive form of reason, where one clearly recognizes the morality of all decisions. What is involved here is a subtle form of translation of the two poles of conscious experience, subjective and objective, into a unified transcendent intuition of pure faith.
Why did you resign? Peace.
Yeah, let me out.
You resigned for peace.
Yes, let me out.
You're a fool.
For peace of mind.
What?
For peace of mind!
Why?
Because too many people know too much.
Never.
I know too much.
Tell me.
I know too much about you.
I don't.
I do.
I don't.
I know you.
Who am I?
You are an enemy.
I'm on your side.
Yeah.
Why did you resign?
You've been told.
Tell me again.
Yes. I know you.
You're smart.
In my mind. In my mind. You're smart.
Why did you resign? Yeah, you see? Why did you resign?
You know who you are? A fool.
What? Don't.
Yes.
No, don't.
Yes, an idiot.
Number 6, unable to fight any longer, tells number 2 why he resigned, for peace of mind. This was told to us already in a previous episode, where number 6 confesses that his resignation was a matter of conscience. Amazingly, however, number 2 cannot seem to grasp this reason. Instead, he continues to ask the question over and over. He's determined that it must be top-secret state confidential, when in reality his reason is purely existential in nature. He sought to live morally and authentically, something that number 2 doesn't comprehend. Number 6 also says that too many people know too much, that he knows too much about number 2, that number 2 is an idiot and is his enemy. These statements reflect the disillusionment he's experiencing. In everyday life, one has preconceived notions of right and wrong, which may greatly reduce the genuine exercise of faith in terms of moral choice. However, by this phase of the Dark Night, one has been forced to reevaluate everything which previously stood. Consequently, one's conscience, in moral terms, now becomes extremely sensitive. One finds himself faced with moral scruples and decisions, which from another's point of view might seem utterly trivial, but which now have agonizing weight. Relief from this inner struggle is obtained only with an intuitive signal received in faith that one has chosen the correct course of action. The reason for this is because one's highly eroded ego strength, by this stage, is identified with an overwhelming need to remain faithful to one's conscience. There is a strong belief now that failure in this regard will sever the last remaining link with reality and would plunge one into oblivion.
I'll kill you. I'll die. You're dead. Let me out. Dead. Kill me.
Open it! Open it! Open the door!
Kill me. Find out.
Get up, you fool!
Can't?
In the war you killed?
Yeah.
You killed for fun!
For peace.
Do as I say!
I do as I've told.
The struggle can prove a Sisyphean task, as one is continually faced with new moral decisions, requiring an even greater degree of faith. It's at this point in the drama that number 2's service in World War II is brought up. Number 2 accuses him of killing for fun, to which number 6 replies that he merely did what he was told. At this point, things become even more difficult. New mirror structure development in relation to these internal moral structures begin to take place. In the drama, the peace of mind scene segues directly into the bomber scene. Number 6 now seems to have undergone the process yet again, with all previous development undone, and is reliving his experience in World War II. However, he hesitates to release his bombs, dovetailing the questions of conscience of the previous scene. The scene ends with him jumping into the darkness. The progression of the Dark Night is by no means linear, and its relativity of phenomenal circumstance requires an exercise of faith. One may make a great psychological development, only to have all supports and progress voided. The delicate light of conscience in making decisions is also slowly taken away, so that one is left feeling totally alone and abandoned in the dark, living solely by faith with a growing conviction that one has finally lost one's way. This leads us to the POW scene.
12 seconds to 0. Stand by release. All set? Set. 11. 11. 10. 10. 9. 9. 8. 8. 7. 7. 6. 6. 5. 6. 5. 6. 5. 6. 5. 6. 5. 3. 2. 1. 1. 0. Go. 0. Go. 0. 0. 0. Go. 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 Move it, shut you fool. Wake up. Bring it on. Return run. Let him go as soon as the turn comes. Stand by. Standing by. Approaching. Again. Let go. Now. Bomb's gone. Good boy. Bullseye. Big. Fail up. Sie sind 19 Jahre alt. Sie suchen ihren Ruhm. Sie töten ohne Gedacht.
I do not wish to kill.
See curtain holding it up.
If the aircraft will hit, I have to bail out over your territory. It is not my fault. I cannot help bailing out.
Sie werfen viele Bomben ab.
My arrival is a fact, but I have to tell you nothing.
Unverschämt!
0, go.
How dare you?
Go! Go, go, go!
The more arduous, intense stages of the Dark Knight unearths latent psychotic tendencies. The Dark Knight is very unnatural, being the psychological equivalent of incarceration in an underground cell. Although initially a faint light permits some degree of buoyancy, after continued purgation, all remaining light is extinguished. Also, at this stage, one may be reaching a point of physical and emotional exhaustion. It's at this point, still trying to cling to a reality that has all but vanished, that one becomes prone to neurosis. The language barrier in this scene illustrates the inadequacy to communicate the plight that one experiences during this stage of the Dark Knight. One is so immersed in a deep unconscious level of experience that one loses contact with normal social skills. Number 6, however, far from appearing broken by an unspecified length of internment, and the process in general, is surprisingly jovial. This marks a turning point in the drama. To understand why number 6 has reached this point, we must consider one of the broader themes of the episode, memory. Memory is the means by which we can extend our experience in space and time. However, our fears, inhibitions, and complexes are accumulated in memory, which have an imprisoning effect on our psyches. We have external and internal memory, as well as conscious and unconscious memory. Memory works at the circular level in a very different way than it does on the linear level. Meaningful understanding involves the combination of content which is independent and rationally explicit, yet also interdependent through a unifying, implicit intuitive understanding. The condition of the linear level to separate contents of memory is reversed at the circular level. Through the Dark Knight's erosion of explicit memory, rigidity in understanding is greatly reduced, increasing the ability for implicit, intuitive recognizing of the unity of unconnected events. We must remember that number 2, although currently portraying a German soldier who has captured number 6, has been playing stand-in for all the father figures, authority figures, and manifestation of number 6's resulting superego structure made from these animus stand-ins throughout his life. The psychological mirroring has been confronted and fought, as if alien to number 6. In this scene, however, we see a number 6 who seems almost oblivious to his surroundings. In the Dark Knight, as one feels more in danger of being swallowed up by this black hole, one may become completely oblivious to one's surroundings, as if one has become totally forgotten, no longer with a past history. This can be a liberating experience, for the problems of ego life are tied up with memory contents which continuously reinforce a restricted pattern of behavior. Therefore, with the wiping out of memory contents, former habits can be undone so that one may be born again. With a high level of spiritual development, memory works in a very transcendent, flexible way. One lives in the present, holding no possession over former memories, good or bad. We should note that this looking back through time is done with a distinct air of laughter. The image ideal imposed by his father, his schoolmaster, authority figures, and his society is met with a mocking laughter. He can now say the number 6 without guilt or stigma. He has stepped out of the tyranny of the superego, the linear level, and of the past, and like descending from a mountain, he walks down the steps of the barred embryo room.
Go! I'm a friend.
Yeah.
Why did you resign? I'm a friend.
8.
Why did you resign?
8.
Why?
6. 6. Yeah? 4.
No.
2. No. 1.
No.
0 go.
No.
I'm hungry.
What would you like?
Supper.
This is not the conclusion of the drama, though. Number 6's Dark Night of the Soul is not over yet. and the supreme crisis point is fast approaching.
You're free.
No, I'm number 2.
You are number nothing.
I'm number 2!
1 minute, 35 seconds.
Why'd you resign?
I didn't accept. Why did you accept?
You resigned!
I rejected.
You accepted before you resigned!
I rejected.
Who? You. Why me?
You're big.
Not all.
Not tall.
I'm big.
Humpty Dumpty.
All King's horses.
All the king's men.
That's right.
Couldn't put Humpty together again.
During the super-rational stages of the Dark Knight, we see the final reversal. There is now enormous evolution of the personal self, with a corresponding involution of the physical world. The incredible degree of stress and tension resulting from this creates dramatic and remarkable spiritual expansion. Two singularities are finally approached. On the one hand, there is the self, which has evolved spiritually to that point or inner center of being with all ego baggage stripped away. And on the other hand, the world of illusion, which has involved as if it has gone through a gravitational collapse within a black hole, returning to a physical point representing the beginning of creation. One has reached both the goal or end of self-evolution and the source or beginning of physical evolution. But instead of joy, one experiences failure and an existential crisis of the first magnitude. Number 6's recovery represents the attainment to the super-rational stage, whereas the transference of the degree-absolute process onto number 2 represents this reversal. The corresponding collapse and involution of the world being the presence of the clock counting down to 0, and to the impending death of one of them.
You chose this method because you knew the only way to beat me was to gain my respect. That is correct. And then I would confide.
I hope that you would come to trust me.
This is a recognized method.
Used in psychoanalysis. The patient must come to trust his doctor. Totally.
Sometimes they change places.
Which is essential in extreme cases.
Also a risk.
Oh, grave risk.
If the doctor has his own problems.
I have.
That is why the system is known as degree absolute.
It's one or the other of us.
Why don't you resign?
You're very good. You're very good at it. He thinks you're the boss now.
I am.
I'm number 2. I'm the boss. Open the door.
Number 1 is the boss.
No.
3 minutes. You're scared.
No.
Take it.
Fool!
Yes. A fool. Not a rat.
You're scared.
Want me to come in?
Let you out?
No, stay away.
Want to come out?
Keep out!
You're mine.
Stop him!
2 minutes.
Stop him!
2 minutes.
1 minute to go.
59 seconds. 58 seconds.
I'm big.
57.
Oh, you're too.
56.
Yeah.
55.
Lad.
54.
God.
53.
You're for me.
52. 51. 50. 49. 48.
Why?
47.
Why?
46.
Why did I?
45.
Tell me.
44. 43. 42. 41.
Anything you do.
40.
I'll tell.
39.
I'll tell.
38.
Yes, no time.
37.
Still time.
36.
Still time.
35.
Still time. Hey, not too late.
For me,
For me.
you snivel and grovel.
I ask.
You crawl.
Yes, look.
To ask?
Yes, to ask.
Why? Ask on. Ask yourself.
There is a major turning point in the narrative. We are now presented with number 2's unconscious fears. He fears the loss of his status. He fears the repercussions of his masters. But most of all, he fears death. And in the darker recesses of his psyche, he feels hatred and envy for number 6, who possesses everything he does not have and what he cannot break. Much of this is established at the beginning of the episode.
A likely lad. Why do you care? Take it easy. Relax. Why do you care?
Number 6, please.
Why do you care?
I know your voice.
I have been here before. Why do you care?
You'll never know.
Wait and see.
This may explain why we hear a voice cry for number 6 to die, as number 2 counts down to suffering presumably a stress-induced heart attack.
Too late.
8,
7,
6.
6.
Die, 6, die! Die! Die!
3,
Die! Die!
1.
Die! Die!
Nietzsche was among the first to slay these beasts. He would most likely describe the village as the creation of what he called the spiders. Nietzsche showed us the deeper psychological modus operandi of the world controllers, and the reasons go further than just control for its own sake. He attacked the type of person whose defining quality was one of resentment. He said that the type of person who felt the need to control others was driven mainly by a hatred for those he controls, and that this hatred comes from unconscious feelings of inferiority, not superiority. His spiders were constitutionally malformed. They cannot see or create beauty, and have no virtue. The seats of power provide substitutes for the virtues and abilities they lack, in which they can act out their hatred against those with virtue or ability or health. This kind of person has multiplied and evolved their skills in the 20th century, reaching higher levels of control and malevolence. They may have traded the robes of priests for suits and casual clothing, but they are nonetheless spiders in the Nietzschean sense. Number 2 is Nietzsche's tarantula, driven by self-loathing and envy, who takes number 6, the overman, the man of virtue and of will to power, down into his filthy hole to ensnare him, only to be strangled himself in the tangles of his own web.
This is it. For better or worse. Who knows? 1 week. 1 teeny-weeny week, my boy. Neither of us can leave. Till death do us part. And I brought it on myself. Who knows?
If considered as still part of number 6's dark night, number 2's breakdown and descent may be seen as another unconscious mirror structure of number 6. But this time, he is experiencing it from a super-rational position. In this sense, number 6 is now playing the animus figure, while number 2 is the one under its dominion. The self is in a continual dynamic relationship with the world. This implies twin complementary poles, so that positive movement in one relatively implies negative movement in the other. Positive movement coincides with negative movement. Progression coincides with regression. Evolution coincides with involution. In the circular level, each positive stage of development is balanced by a corresponding negative stage. Thus, psychological evolution doesn't take place in a positive linear direction, but rather in complementary positive and negative directions, i.e. in a circular fashion. Number 2's death, the end of this corresponding negative movement, is the final mirroring of number 6's dark night. In number 2, we see aspects of number 6, experienced within his dark night. Needless to say, number 6 had no intention to see number 2 die, but he could not save him from perishing. He died from his own psychological complexes, many of which are not unknown to number 6. His death comes hard upon number 6, as is evident by his reaction, and in his anger towards the apathy of the supervisor, who arrives just after number 2 dies.
Congratulations. We shall need the body for evidence.
After this point, and continuing into the next episode, there is a noticeable change in the demeanor of number 6. The resolution of the Dark Knight crisis is just such a change. It is a shift from yang to yin. We tend to think of a religious conversion in transcendent terms as a movement in the direction of spirit. However, with the yang pole reaching its extreme, there is a need to move in the opposite direction towards yin, from transcendent to immanent. But this often comes only after a terrible crisis. Throughout the increasingly desperate psychological states one endures in the dark night of the soul, one continues to hang on in faith, attempting to transcend one's circumstances. However, facing the ultimate loss, one finally lets go of faith itself. In that dramatic moment, life is mysteriously reborn, and there is the first glimmering of renewed hope. In the end, number 2 and number 6 cancel each other out, as positive and negative, matter and antimatter, conscious and unconscious cancel each other out in the mirror structure to create a new psychic energy and new synthesis. In this new synthesis, we see an example of Hegel's holistic approach, based explicitly on the dynamic of complementary opposites, which is appropriate to the circular level. This is Hegel's often misunderstood triadic movement known as the dialectical movement of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. Number 6's dark night becomes number 2's. The latter does not survive. Number 6 triumphs, but he has been forever changed. He will no longer be referred to as number 6. He has moved from the circular level to what we may call the point level. The outcome of the dark night of the soul, even in victory, is both a healing and a wounding. When Jacob wrestled with the angel until he prevailed and received the angel's blessing, he walked with a limp afterward. One will still grieve for the life that is gone and can never be recovered. That is the cost of transformation. Number 2's death is symbolic of the death of number 6's ego, which in the final conflict of the episode was transferred onto number 2. It has shattered, like the glass he throws to the ground. But what may at first seem like the total destruction of the ego is only the beginning of the emergence of a more profound, more encompassing sense of self.
What do you desire?
Number 1.
I'll take you.
Number 6's journey doesn't end here. He must go deeper still into the unconscious mind in the final episode, Fallout. But that's a topic for another video. The dark night of the soul is never a happy, joyful, pleasant experience, and few would ever volunteer to go through it. But it comes just the same. Whether it be Persephone, abducted by Pluto while picking flowers in a garden and taken down into the underworld, or the prince in Rapunzel, Percival in the Grail legends, or in the tragedies of everyday life, initiation happens whether we like it or not. As the Latin proverb goes, he who goes willingly, the fates will lead. He who does not go willingly, the fates will drag. To quote Albert Camus, "There is no sun without shadow, and it is essential to know the night."